When you're slapping knuckles with another grown man in a locked cage on what is essentially national television, you got a couple things to worry about. Namely, dying in front of your family, but one of the few things you don't have to worry about, or at least you're not supposed to have to worry about, is getting kicked in the sack. It's kind of an oxymoron because in reality, you are making a career out of living in the evolved form of the Django slave fight scene. The only difference today is that you're not allowed to take the extra 15 seconds to finish the job after a knockout and the eye gouging and nutshot stuff. But I mean, let's be really frank here. How long after a fight is normally stopped do you think it would take Francis Ngannou to send Alistair Overeem to the actual Shadow Realm? Or John Jones, how long after Gone Tapped would it have taken John to strangle all that proportioned musculature to death? I don't think that long. So in reality, the refs existing and the rules existing to protect the fighters from prison tactics is a massive innovation and a signal to anyone that thinks the world is declining that the world is indeed putting a condom on our barbarism. Now, the only problem with that utopian description of the UFC is that all that safety bullshit relies solely on one individual. One stinky old used up individual hired by a pseudo mob boss for the purposes of charging treasonous ticket rates. Safety doesn't really fit into that equation. However, in a sport that's chock full of incompetent officiating, there are absolutely standout individuals who go out of their way to protect these fighters. And when I say go out of their way, I'm not talking about Jimbo behind the counter who cooks your steak right every time. I'm talking about Jimbo behind the counter that cooks your steak right every time and seasons the meat with complimentary heroin. In other words, there are levels to reffing, and I'm gonna bring them to you in the official UFC referee tier list. Now, if you've seen my tier lists in the past, you'll know I don't rank stuff based on my personal opinion. If I did, Herb Dean would be 87% of this video. It makes it so much juicier when you establish a fair scoring system for all parties involved and create a tier list based on the final scores. So here are the criteria. Each referee is judged on their last 20 UFC fights, with the exception of Gary Copeland. I had to use 2 of his PFL fights because he's mostly a PFL Bellator ref, but I couldn't not include him. His funky buffness is iconic. Other than him, all the main characters are judged specifically on their previous 20 UFC fights, counting back from UFC 306. I wanted to do 10 because that's only 32 hours of fights, but I needed this to be as fair as possible, so I went nuts out and spent 3 days watching UFC fights, intently searching for fouls and replaying finishes over and over to assess the quality of the third man. Which brings me to my first point of analysis, stoppages. For me, there are 4 kinds of stoppages: perfect, great, bad, and horrific. Early is its own thing, but for the purposes of simplicity, we're gonna boil it down to great stoppages, late stoppages, and early stoppages. A great stoppage, by my definition, is a KO/TKO stopped within 2 punches of unconsciousness or within 5 punches on a defenseless fighter. Great stoppages are going to subtract 5 points from the referee's score. 5 points of redemption for a ref who actually does his job. Late stoppages are going to be worth 8 points and are defined as 8 or more punches on a shelled up opponent who is clearly unable to continue but isn't unconscious, or 4 or more punches to an opponent who is unconscious. I know on paper that looks like I'm giving the refs a lot of leeway, but the speed at which things happen in the UFC makes it hard to not give the refs a little bit of a break. On the flip side, early stoppages are going to be worth 7 points because it's slightly less egregious than a late stoppage and is glass cannon defined as any stoppage where the fighter is showing a clear ability to fight back. There's no specific amount of punches a fighter needs to land to be considered an early stoppage. All that matters is, did the ref stop the fight when the loser still had some fight in him? The second point of analysis, and arguably the most important, is allowed fouls. This is something that happens all the time where a fighter commits an obvious foul but doesn't suffer any consequences. A recent and pretty rough example of this is Vanessa Demopoulos getting her glove grabbed as grabbly as it could possibly be grabbed. It was the MMA equivalent of the infamous Saints-Rams no call, and because of that, each individual foul that the fight is not stopped for will be worth 2 points. Whether it's a cage grab or an eye rape, it'll all be scored the same. That way, the more common, less impactful fouls get evened out with the less common, more impactful fouls. It'll also be counted as allowed if the foul is committed twice in the same round without being deducted a point. Even if the ref stops the fight for both fouls, he's got to take a point after the second violation or it's considered an allowed foul. All these criteria will be applied to the top 10 most active UFC refs of 2024. So without further ado, let's get to the results. Leading off our list of remedials, we got Big Dumb Mergliotta, who's been the poster child for mediocrity since the early 2000s. This Sons of Anarchy extra looks and officiates like he'd be a pig in shit if Dana let him ref with a draft beer and an unfiltered cigarette. Dan's reffing is like when you go to class baked as and the teacher asks you a question based on the subject matter she just discussed. If you're a cool kid, you'll just play it off with charm and then the teacher afterward. If you're me, the lunch you just ate starts bubbling up as you malfunction and people start laughing at you. That's Dan. When anything of importance goes down in the octagon, it almost appears to surprise him. It's like his pesky responsibilities are interrupting his daydreams about how far he thinks he could make it into the UFC headquarters if he shaved his face and pretended to be Dana. He's just standing there like a fucking dog waiting for food, and then bam, somebody gets knocked out and he's got to jump in. Now, to give him credit where credit's due, he does jump in there at a speed he shouldn't be able to reach. But as far as pretty much every other aspect of his job, he is a fucking sloppy abortion. So to start this off, we have a lot of subject matter to go through, and I really don't see any of these examples as particularly better or worse than the other. So I'm gonna do it like the news does white girl murders and just pick them out of a hat. We got Caio Baralho versus Jared Cannonier. This one was a dirty fight from the get-go. Fucking Puerto Rican John Jones came in hot with the razor fingers, and surely enough, it took him less than 2 minutes to give Jared what I can only describe as mace face. It got an excessively gnarly reaction from Jared Bear, and it made me wonder, you think, well, razor shards in the gloves is obviously illegal federally, let alone against the rules, but what about sticking all your fingers up a hooker's ass who has AIDS and then doing your walkout directly after? You see Izzy stepping in there with nail polish on his fingers, which cannot be good to get poked in the eye with, and you don't think he possibly maybe had those installed right before he came out of the locker room? Are you catching my drift here? I'm not gonna dive into the rule books to find out, but let's say Caio dips his fingers in fucking hot mustard sauce before the walkout. Is the feel up guy gonna smell his fingers and know something's up? Or is Jared gonna find out when he gets an eyeball full of Arby's? And also, it. Let's kill the alternate possibility, and let's say it's actually in the rule book that you can't fight with immigrant spit on your fingers. What if Caio put some odorless, untraceable cleaning agent on his hands? Some type of Clorox bullshit. I know everybody's freaking out about steroids, but I say the real silent killer is old malaria fingers over here. Thankfully, Dan stopped the action at Jared's request, and Caio was nice enough not to throw the 9 punches he had time to throw before Dan got in there. When the fight resumed, Jared didn't show any signs of being terribly bothered, but the next controversy occurred in the midpoint of the second round when Jared ducked in for a right hand, accidentally headbutting Baralho right above his eye. Now, I would normally call this poetic justice, you know, him and his bugle fingers, but as Baralho looked at Big Dan to signal to him about the headbutt, Dan just kind of nods at him in affirmation. There was nothing else. He didn't even consider stepping in for Baralho, who was clearly impacted by the foul significantly enough to have to blink his eye out. Next up, we got a lesser known gem that occurred on the prelims of Ankalaev versus Walker 2. The undefeated Tom Nolan went up against the many times defeated Nicholas Mota. Tom was a 3-1 favorite as you'd expect, but a face full of fist turned all that around. Mota lands a counter left hook followed by a right hand. Both land right on the button. You can tell Mota wasn't expecting it to happen because he jumps on the finish with no regard for the rules. He landed a conservatively tallied 3 back of the head strikes during the finish, and the reason I say conservatively tallied is because the shady awful UFC only showed the original ref obscured view with no other angles. None of these back of the head strikes were acknowledged, and the amount of fouls that were committed that night will only truly be known by the second camera guy. The next example pains me to include because I and everyone with a brain wishes intermittent, non-lethal cancers on Cody Brundage. But the unfortunate truth is that he had every right to do what he did on the night of Cortez versus Nama Nunez. Cody faced off with Abdul Razak Al Hassan in the main card opener. I don't know who the f decided this was a good idea. Cody is a half-retarded 7'2" offsuit of a fighter who already did his best to f up UFC 300. Yet these matchmaking throw him in the exact same position. Can they not make a 13-second break from expensive pussy to say, hey, maybe it'd be a good idea to hide this guy? We have a place where people we hate are put. There's no fucking reason to expose this man to any more humiliation than he's already suffered. Matter of fact, his creepy coach, who does a shit job pretending not to hate him, needs to sack up and tell this dude he picked the wrong career. Either way, the fight in question began with an immediate takedown attempt by Cody. Abdul stuffed it and blasted some allegedly clean elbows, dropping Cody to his knees. After which, Abdul took out all his repressed Ghanan memories on Cody's brainstem. There were no obscured angles, and I once again conservatively counted 9 back of the head strikes. A lot of them were right on the border of legality, but there were so many fouls committed before Cody lost consciousness that Dan was forced to step in and stop the action. He only claimed to have seen 2 of those 9 fouls, including the final blow, which is 2 more than I thought he would, so I guess credit to him for that. And credit to him for giving Cody his pacifier and a Wendy's Frosty to munch on until the scaries went away. Our next example, and mind you, these are examples from a 20-fight sample. I did not make an extra effort to ruin Dan Mergliotta's reputation with all his infamous screw-ups. He is just simply manure at his job. Anyway, I digress, and we continue with Jack Della Maddalena versus Gilbert Burns on the main card of UFC 299. This is one of those fights where you look at both guys and think they're so sportsmanlike in all facets of life. There's no possible way you're gonna find foul play. But it turns out Jack Della Maddalena scraps like a dirty little bitch. And I say that with all due respect. I love seeing the student outsmart the teacher, but to me, Gilbert Burns is the angel on the UFC's shoulders, so it was kind of hard to watch. It started in the middle of the first round after Gilbert successfully implemented his grappling. Now, the context of this first foul kind of makes it unintentional, but I counted it anyway because Dan didn't address it. Basically, Jack Della Maddalena came into UFC 299 with one thing on his mind, and that is knock this Modelo drinking choke murder specialist out before he gets his hands on you. Jack landed virtually nothing before Gilbert's first takedown attempt, and instantly Jack was in a bad spot. So I completely understand why Jack would throw a frivolous knee to Gilbert's grounded face after whittling your way out of his grip for 2 minutes. I mean, it's like watching someone escape from prison when they get away from Gilbert. But Dan Mergliotta should have at least had the replay question the legality of that knee. Half the commentary team is autistic and they question the shit. The fight continues without any mishaps until the late third round finish, and damn it, it's not Jack's fault, but Dan's inaction here infuriates me. Jack lands 7 back of the head elbows with Dan standing right there in frame. Doesn't give a warning or anything, not that Jack would have heard it. Instead, he just let the finish ensue the way nature intended it. Our next example brings us to the co-main event of Cannonier versus Imavov. Dustin Jacoby was taking on Dominic Reyes in what was supposed to be a punishment for what Dominic did to Dana's hubby, but the tables quickly turned as Dominic landed his patented moving backward left hand, absolutely rocking Dustin's shit. He did the stanky leg all the way across the octagon, only to meet a beautifully timed knee to the face. He finally drops, and he's clearly unable to continue, so at this point, I would say, alright, 5 to 8 more unanswered punches by Dominic, and this one's finished. Instead, Dustin had to eat 10 shots, 14 if Dominic landed all of them, and I didn't count the back of the head strike because it was grazing, but this is the only late stoppage in 20 fights for Dan Mergliotta. A ton of allowed fouls, though. Alright, now it's time to give Dan his moment of redemption, the only gold star on his resume of shit smudges. It went down in the apex between Chaos Williams and Carlston Harris. There's really not much of a build up to this one. Carlston Harris was out cold in 90 seconds. Out of nowhere, big, apparently agile Dan Mergliotta had a sixth sense to jump in there before Carlston even knew he was out. Chaos was able to slip in one more Mickey before Dan got in there, but for a man of that size to blast off that quick, it earns my respect. Or in other words, nothing. Moving up the list of least likely to succeed, we have the iconic melted action figure Gary Copeland. This one's an interesting case because the man scored damn near as high as Dan Mergliotta, but 70% of his nonsense is isolated to a ball shot here and 2 cage grabs there. He's really inconsistent at recognizing fouls, but I think the fact that he only refs twice a month keeps him from that one big fuck up everybody ends up remembering him for. We do, however, have 2 spicy muffins to get to, and we're gonna start with the one I enjoyed most live, Chris Weidman versus Bruno Silva. This fight should be a PSA to all the fighters who think life is fair. You got Chris Weidman coming out the first round, razor fingers out. Dude does it every fucking time he fights, and I'm telling you, if you don't start enforcing these goofy rules, you're gonna keep having this, bro. These refs keep acting like Skyrim guards, and fucking gun-toting criminals like Weidman are gonna keep slipping by with no consequences. In this case, Silva fell right into Weidman's trap 2 rounds in and gave Weidman everything he needed to seal the deal. You see, eye poking isn't only about sticking your finger inside your opponent's face. There's also a multitude of mental games that come along with it that I'll detail some other time. But one thought that certainly occurs when you're dealing with an eye poker is, how can I use this douchebag strategy to draw a foul? It's not the most intelligent strategy on the planet, but it's the strategy Bruno Silva picked when Weidman mushed his face in a perfectly symmetrical fashion. There was no eye poke whatsoever. Silva was shamelessly feigning Mace face. You can tell the difference between someone who's being a pussy and someone who actually looks like they just took their gas mask off in basic. Meanwhile, Chris denied responsibility and Gary Copeland was too preoccupied with thoughts of skinless pork chops to talk to him about his fingers. When the fight resumed, both guys went to war until the bell, and Bruno dodged all the fingers like a champ. It seemed as though barrages of punches overloaded Weidman's defense, where he didn't have time to put his hands out there. I'm not sure if that was Bruno's plan, but it was very unfortunate for him that the round had to end, because 30 seconds into round 3, Chris landed sort of an awkward knuckle eye poke that if gone the other way would have snapped his fucking finger in half. Then you got stupid Gary over here looking right at it. Gary, this is the part where even if it wasn't intentional, you gotta stop the action to give Chris Weidman a talking to about his outstretched fingers. See, this is the paradox of MMA rules. Some refs don't step in if it looks like a foul hasn't affected the fighter too badly, which incentivizes fighters to react dramatically to a foul so the ref knows to step in. But when they react dramatically to a foul, they're also taking a risk that the ref didn't see it, and when they get finished, all the commentators are gonna call him a pussy for not fighting through the eye poke. Friggin' catch-22 these guys gotta live with, and Bruno Silva got it worse than most. After the unacknowledged knuckle poke, Bruno returns fire with an eye poke attempt of his own. He throws a right hand with his thumb stealthily pointed outward, and it landed right where he wanted it to, despite Weidman's swollen eye making it a hard target. The only problem was that Weidman already activated his much more advanced counter eye poke systems, and this is a sad lesson Bruno had to learn. You can't eye poke with an eye poke spammer. That's something you do as a last resort when your fucking eyeball's hanging by a string and Yamasaki's not doing anything about it. It made way more sense to go back to the swinging wild strategy. Weidman's got the bum leg to end all bum legs. Calf kicks outside poking distance and hoping would have been a better option. And here's the other funky thing. Bruno's eye poke landed worse than Weidman's, but Bruno's the guy who collapses in the fetal. Chris is a 5th degree samurai in eye poking. Dude looked at stupid Bruno's eye poke like Crocodile Dundee looked at the mugger's switchblade. You're not gonna phase him with rookie shit. Regardless, Gary had no choice but to step in and the action was stopped. Now, since Bruno doesn't speak English, he probably thought he won the battle, but Gary Copeland miraculously noticed and addressed the sneaky eye poke attempt by Bruno, and so the foul was considered mutual. I don't know how he saw that shit, because I certainly didn't until I played it back. Bruno disguised his thumb tremendously well. You can see the thumb extend for the poke right when the punch connects, and then unextend as his fist breaks away. That is some Mission Impossible shit, and I would remove 2 points from Copeland's score for catching that if I could. When the fight resumes, Weidman goes right back to what he was doing, claws a clawing, and you can see Copeland visually sigh. Look at him. He knows exactly what Weidman's going for. It's like he doesn't know he can say something to him. Maybe he's just self-conscious about his voice. I feel that. It's hard to be built like a half-story building and sound like you eat cigarette butts. But by the 3rd round of a high-stakes fight, if Michael Bisping of all people is wondering why you're not doing your job, you gotta power through the self-hatred and dish out some discipline. Copeland didn't do that, and Weidman continued his assault relentlessly. Bruno survived another minute and a half before his ultimate demise came at an eye poke that I have a hard time looking at. Weidman's finger gets so far up in there, Bruno's eyeball globs to the side like a fucking science fiction movie. And because Copeland had this fucked up delusion that both guys were mutually poking at each other, even though Weidman was clearly the guilty party, he, I guess, saw this one as fair game and just let the finish proceed. It was a sad ending turned hilarious when the finish was reviewed by officials and then re-ruled as a decision victory for Weidman, meaning somebody with a suit on looked at that disgusting eye poke and said, him, he deserved it. Even Weidman was savage in the post-fight interview. He was like, dude, I'm sorry I tried to rearrange your cornea for 15 minutes, but you faked it twice and I had to show you what a real one felt like. And that's what everyone wanted at that point. You felt a tiny bit sorry for Bruno's permanent eyesight dysfunction, but by the 3rd or 4th eye poke, if the ref's not doing anything about it, you gotta start fighting like it's a prison riot, and Bruno didn't do that, so fuck him. Next up, we have Bill Algeo taking on Kyle Nelson on the main card of Blanchfield versus Fiore. These dudes went at it straight away, no technique, no soft wieners. It was fantastic to watch. All of a sudden, Nelson hits Algeo with a nasty overhand right, giving Algeo the wobbly wobbles, and in comes the fun police, standing close enough to smell Algeo's gooch sweat. Bro about got ran the fuck into while Nelson went for the finish, but the finish never came because Copeland decided he'd seen enough. In my opinion, Algeo was perfectly able to fire back at Nelson. I don't see wobbling as a reason to assume he was finished, but that was the end of that. So that's all of Copeland's notable screw-ups. Now it's time to get to some redemption. We return once again to the Blanchfield versus Fiore card, so I guess Gary didn't do all that bad that night. It was Anton Turkalj versus Ibo Aslan in the prelims, and if you don't know about the beef between these two guys, it's beefy. Anton was the only individual who was able to beat Ibo on the come up, and while Anton got his shot at the Contender Series in 2021, Ibo had to grind his way through promotions until 2023 with a no longer undefeated record. Combine that with the fact that Anton went total roid rage when he choked choked him out, and you got an authentic UFC beef match. So I gotta give props to the second most ass ref on the tier list, because it really was essential to stop this fight before an attempted murder. It happened after 2 rounds in the pit. Anton took the first round, Ebo took the second, but it was an all-out war for 10 minutes. When the bell rung for the final round, tensions amplified as Anton Kardashian smacks Ebo's glove touch away. A move that he would come to regret, as a massive overhand right drops the Pleasure Man flat on his ass. It was surprisingly the first knockdown of the fight, and at first it didn't exactly scream fight ending, but with some kind of fucking voodoo telepathy, Copeland rushes in and stops the fight before another strike lands, revealing the truly horrific state of Anton. He was totally unconscious, sitting in an upright position, basically teed up for an uppercut. You could have given the guy laughing gas and he wouldn't have been that vulnerable. So Gary gets a gold star for that one, and if the Pleasure Man ever fights again, he knows who to thank for his unbroken face. The last great stoppage comes again in the Blanchfield versus Fior prelims. Gary definitely ran out of Ensure as the night went on. He was fucking phenomenal on the prelims and just collapsed on the main card, so I don't know what happened there. But Herbert Burns was taking on Julio Arce. Hopefully you haven't, but if you happen to catch a Herbert Burns fight from time to time, you'll know that the Burnses are not the Manning family. Herbert is and was never ready to take his athletic career beyond bathrobe wrestling. He did very well with his hobby, and I'm sure Gilbert hooked him up with all the pharmaceutical chicken and broccoli he could eat, but crossing over to the UFC has been a catastrophic embarrassment. Thankfully, we get to go through one of the least hard to watch losses because he got knocked out before he had a chance to surrender. It was a minute 50 into the second round, and Julio started applying some serious pressure to his gassed out opponent. He landed 6 shots before Herbert found a split second to circle away from the cage, but a tasteful left hand followed by another broke down Herbert's guard and landed square on the chin. Gary quickly jumped in behind Julio, who was fiending to pulverize Herbert's face some more. So major props to Gary for 2 wonderful stoppages on the same card. He's obviously got a great sense of when the fight's over, if not slightly early on the trigger. It's mostly just these blatant stupid fouls that he does nothing about that put him in D tier. If this list was based on refs aggravating me with their elderliness, Chris Tognoni would be D. There wouldn't even be a tier list. It would just be me sitting here taking intermittent shits and c***ing on a 3D model of Tognoni's head. I have never in my life seen a person less physically qualified for a job than this fucking Gringotts secretary. Tognoni looks like he'd be better suited selling elixirs in a video game than reffing a cage fight. And I don't understand why the folks in charge continue to let this guy slither around the octagon. But we are officially busting the seal on C tier, so let's get into some of this dummy's mishaps. First, we have Felipe dos Santos versus Andre Lima, a highly competitive matchup in the flyweight division. This was the first fight for Lima that didn't have any notable controversies. Of course, his UFC debut ended by getting bitten, and if that wasn't enough crap to go through, the man eats one too many Brazilian donuts before his next weight cut, comes in at 130 pounds, and almost gets robbed by a split decision. One of the worst scorecards in the history of the sport, and now he's got a monster to deal with in Felipe dos Santos. Nothing was going well for the undefeated prospect. He had the entire fan base on his side after the bite tattoo, lost probably half of those people when he missed weight by 5 pounds, and now nobody's gonna f with him after I reveal his cheatery. The first foul occurs in the latter moments of the first round when a Dos Santos suplex is thwarted by a fence grab. Lima gripped the fence so tight that it twanged back into place when he pulled away. It looked like he was stretching time. And then you got Tognoni standing right there in front of the action, fucking nibbling on a sugar cookie. I don't know what the f he was doing. The commentators and Apex fans noticed in real time. Everybody shouted in protest, but there was no stop to the fight, no verbal warnings, no tattoo on the fence that says I got fucking grabbed. Nothing. The fight continued without justice for almost a minute before Lima grabs the fence again while pinning Dos Santos against the fence. This time a verbal warning was given by Tognoni, but the fight was not stopped and no points were taken. The second round went on for almost another minute before Lima grabs the fence a third time. You'd think Tognoni would have no choice but to take a point here. Instead, he finds it fitting to half-assed swat Lima's hand out of the cage. We are now at 3 cage grabs, one of which negated what could have been a crucial takedown for Santos, and Tognoni is basically letting him do it. Later in the round, Dos Santos goes for a takedown that Lima reverses recovers into a takedown of his own and maintains top control for the rest of round 2. During the smothering, Lima puts his hands over the face of Dos Santos, maliciously swiping his fingers back and forth across Santos's eyelids, using his index finger to like flick Dos Santos's closed eyelid upward. I haven't seen anyone in the UFC try this technique, but it's really smart when you think about those pesky times when your opponent won't let you eye gouge them. All you gotta do is pop the hood open from the bottom up. Lima was able to do this 2 times with nothing but a verbal warning from Tognoni. He kept it clean from that point on, and I'm not sure a point deduction would have made a difference anyway, but Lima's a dirty little bastard is what I learned from this fight. The next fight took place on the Alan Curtis 2 prelims between Victor Hugo and Pedro Falcao. The first 2 rounds almost went by without a hitch. Falcao snagged the cage for a split second and Tognoni warned him in a language he doesn't understand. Not a huge deal, it didn't help or hurt Falcao's position. When the third round started, Tognoni took yet another opportunity to neglect his responsibilities as a beautiful spinning back kick barely misses the target. Or maybe it hits the target perfectly, who knows how f***ed up Hugo is, but the heel of the kick landed full force on Falcao's nutsack. It happened in full, straightforward view of Tognoni, who declared it a clean strike. Falcao was absolutely bewildered by Tognoni's inaction, and if that wasn't the pits, Falcao had to suffer 2 more unattended nut strikes in the final minute. Now this first one in particular bothers me more than the second one. The second one landed much harder, but the first one like dug into the cup right where his left ball and possibly dick rests. That'd be one of those Blitz the League 2 X-ray zoom-ins where the dude's Jimmy fucking explodes, and you can tell Falcao knows he's not getting shit from the ref, so he doesn't even bother reacting. He just fights through it like a savage. He also caught a low blow in the first round that I forgot to mention that Tognoni actually did stop the fight for, but when you combine that with everything else, Falcao's dick and balls had a terrible night. Now we move on to some late stoppages. Starting in week 1 of Dana White's Contender Series, Jose Delgado faced off against Ernie Juarez. That is an uncomfortable name to say, and feels like you're yawning. It was a little more than a minute into round 2 when Juarez shoots for a takedown right as Delgado throws a knee. Juarez ragdolls to his knees, completely unconscious, and receives 4 corpse shots as Tognoni sputters towards the action. The thing about this one that's so aggravating is Juarez's collapse. He basically falls into the arms of Delgado like his fucking newborn fell under a truck. You'd think Tognoni would be rushing in to at least take a closer look at Juarez, but he's just taking these corporate steps from 10 feet out of frame, and he didn't show a shred of urgency until the 4th punch was on its way. Moving on to the main card of Barbosa versus Murphy, we have a finish that would gooch tickle any chronic traumatic encephalopathy enthusiast. Adrian Yanez was taking on Vinicius Salvador, and they were swinging bomb skis, and right as Dominic Cruz began to advise Yanez to throw less bomb skis, life sent him another commentary eviction notice in the form of a winging Yanez right hand. He somehow stays awake when he hits the canvas, but Yanez rushes in with so many accurate ground strikes there was no chance to recover. Salvador takes 9 unanswered shots and the lights go out completely, but Tognoni isn't quite satisfied with the flailing, so he lets Salvador take another 13 for good measure. He was moving around technically, so I guess that's why Tognoni let it go, but Salvador had control of like 1.5 of his limbs. He didn't need to take those extra shots. Finally, we come to Chris Tognoni's singular moment of redemption. It was Peyton Talbot versus Giannis Gamori on the UFC 303 prelims, and there's not much to go over here. Talbot connects a right hand within 15 seconds. Gamori reaches fucking terminal velocity on his way to the canvas, and when Talbot realizes Gamori is still defending himself, he reins him in with some gorgeous ground strikes. Gamori was able to keep his guard up, dodging 3 out of the 8 finishing strikes, but right at the moment he loses consciousness, Chris Tognoni jumps in, allowing only 2 more shots. Could have been 1 if he stuck his arm in the right spot though. Alright, next we have our second C-tier inductee, Mike Yosemite Beltran, the most aesthetically appropriate referee in the business. Fucking looks like Dana bought him at Hot Topic. And to be honest, he's really not that bad of a ref. I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but to me, he seems to notice fouls that are difficult to see on a pretty consistent basis. He also doesn't give a fuck about anything, so when he stops the fight, he has no problem taking 7 minutes to fucking fiercely reprimand a fighter. Regardless though, his sins have brought him to the middle of C-tier with the scrubs, and we're gonna dive right into it. First up, we have Curtis Blades versus Jailton Almeida, a fight that went down as most people expected it to until it didn't. Jailton got a hold of Curtis from the get-go and spent the whole first round slamming him repeatedly. There was no offense other than that, just fucking slams to no avail. Coming out of the second, Jailton again shoots for Curtis's legs, but this time Curtis came prepped with the Kamaru Usman special. He just starts bashing the shit out of Jailton's brainstem. A lot of them were borderline, but 4 out of the 16 finishing strikes were verifiably back of the head. 2 of the punches got cut off by the camera angle, making them clean by default, so the total could be up to 6. And I think what happened here is Beltran absolutely saw the fouls, but he didn't want to stop the fight when he realized the damage was already bad enough that the fight might be ruined by Jailton's inability to continue. It could also be ruined by his ability to continue and make everyone want to eat cyanide cookies for another 10 minutes, so logistically I really can't argue with his decision. Next up, we have immediate redemption for Mike Beltran.
Say what?
Yeah, it kind of shocked me that there were no other notable mistakes, but like I said earlier, he usually doesn't miss a foul more than once or twice in a whole fight. And as soon as he becomes aware that there's some foulery afoot, he again stops the fight and screams at them. I think as soon as he establishes that type of father-son dominance with a roided up killing machine, it's hard to lose that dominance when he's got actual authority to back it up. The first fantastic stoppage comes at the feet of Mauricio Rufy, a guy who really needs to change his name from One Shot to Slip'ema, because he put the beat down of Christ on Jamie Mullarkey. It started with about 4.5 minutes of utter kickboxing domination. Mullarkey didn't have a prayer. Rufy wobbles Mullarkey with a right hand, and before he has time to react, another lightning fast right hand zipped in, landing straight to Mullarkey's jaw. He manages to stay on his feet, successfully dodging a right hook, but the pressure from Rufy was extremely calculated. Mullarkey is obviously next level tough. He shows it in every fight. You just cannot deal with the guy who's got you hurt like that, not when he's picking shots as intelligently as Rufy. He lands one final uppercut, dropping Mullarkey a second time, and within one ground strike, Beltran got in there and stopped the fight. Next up, we head to the main card of UFC 299, and there's no introduction needed here because the only fans who didn't see this one are the ones that died that week. We got Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint Denis. This stoppage was super close to flawless. Beltran let the fight go after a left hand that looked like it could minorly inconvenience a rhinoceros, and then he stops the fight right after Dustin's iconic blow. Now, from a fan's perspective, it was flawless because we got to witness the majesty of that last shot, but technically speaking, Benoit was gone before it landed. Great stoppage though. Our final C-tier inductee barely scraped past Beltran with a total of 43 points. He is no-nonsense Keith Peterson, or as I like to call him, Mountain Dew during a growth spurt, Keith Peterson. We're going to begin our journey on week 3 of the Contender Series between Nick Piccinini and Jack Duffy. It was about midway into the 3rd round and Duffy was getting beat pretty decisively. He then decided to vent his frustrations by grabbing the cage not once, not twice, not even 3 times, 4 times without suffering any consequences. Keith tried to do the old granny slap on Duffy's interlocked fingers, but it didn't stop him from continuing to openly cheat. Next up, we head to the main card of Sandhagen versus Nurmagomedov. This is a fun one because it features the ultra rare and highly collectible double foul, meaning 2 fouls committed within the same strike. You have to be a major piece of shit to pull off a double foul, and I'm sure no one will be surprised to hear it was Figgy. He faced off with Marlon Vera in a high-stakes bantamweight battle for the ages, and at the end of round 1, as the horn sounds, Figgy firmly plants his foot into the face of his grounded opponent. The kick started a single frame before the bell sounded, which would normally mean fair game, but the horn finished horning before Figgy brought the kick down, which tells me it was a malicious late shot, and even if it wasn't, it would still be a grounded opponent. Neither of these 2 issues were addressed by Keith Peterson aside from a charade-style gesture that Figgy most certainly did not understand. Now we get into Keith Peterson's late stoppage, which occurred on the all-too-familiar Blanchfield versus Fior prelims. Connor Matthews and Dennis Bazookia were having a decent back and forth. Matthews did a little grappling while Bazookia did what his name says. All of a sudden, the fun gets interrupted by Matthews taking a Shane Burgos-like tumble after he caught what looked like a non-threatening left hook. He had to take 12 more uncontested shots as he shelled up on the ground, and I think he was finished when he landed. Maybe you could argue 4 shots of recovery time, but 12 seems pretty excessive when a guy falls down like that. Either way, it's time for Keith's redemption. Why the do I have to keep going back to goddamn Blanchfield Fior? I'm sick of acknowledging women exist. This card would have been so much better without these dusty hoes taking up my atmosphere, and to put them over Joaquin Buckley and Vicente Luque, that is... somebody should go to jail for that. But as far as reffing goes, Buckley versus Luque was handled exquisitely, and that's the one we're focusing on. It was the 2nd round, and Luque was rapidly falling behind in the power department, and with no other options, he shoots a god-awful takedown. Buckley easily reverses, putting him flat on his back with a giant fucking something that's not racist smashing him from the top. Luque was able to adequately defend himself for about 30 seconds before Buckley's shots started breaking through the hymen. And this is where you could have a conversation about a late stoppage because Luque shelled up as soon as he hit the canvas. I'm not sure I see him as inable at that point or even during most of the beating. His guard was working exceptionally well. He didn't do a lot of moving around, but like 80% of Buckley's ground and pound landed on the arms. It was extremely impressive for a stationary target, and on the other hand, you could argue an early stoppage because Luque was completely conscious and throwing strikes from the bottom until Keith stopped the fight, which in my opinion is the staple of a great stoppage. If half the people think it's early and the other half thinks it's late, you probably did your job. At long last, we emerge from rock bottom to the slightly above average, and in all seriousness, I gotta take a second to apologize to our first B-tier inductee. I and many others have unfairly and unjustly reduced this man to a pile of with dreads on it. But the truth is, Herb Dean is incredibly consistent at making up for his mistakes, racking in the most doing your job bonuses of any ref on this tier list. He had 4 great stoppages. So let's start off with the screw-ups. We got Steve Garcia taking on Sung Woo Choi. These boys came to fucking bang like two guys whose records don't matter. About 3 wild exchanges into the fight, Garcia blitzes forward with a flurry of punches, most of which connect. Woo Choi tries to plant his feet and fire back, but Steve counters everything. There was little hope for Choi as he tumbled to the canvas with massive ground and pound on its way. One shot led to another that led to 8 unchecked back of the head strikes, and Choi was gonzo. I think he was gonzo without the back of the head strikes, but if Herb had done the minimal his job requires and stopped the fight for a warning, which could have potentially altered the outcome of the fight considering how up Choi was. I mean, 5 minutes is 5 rounds worth of end of the round stool sits. If Choi had the opportunity to take that time and recover, he might still live the rest of his life outside the top 15 with an extra win. So even at B tier, Herb Dean's decision making is affecting the career of these athletes. I might have to take back my apology. Herb has now been downgraded from not a pile of cum to a sanitized frozen hockey puck of cum from the sperm bank with dreads on it. Next up, we have Mikhail Saziani versus Bruno Lopez. It was the second round of a losing fight for Lopez when the cardio of Saziani started to fade. He takes a deep uh-oh breath, cueing Lopez to land a gut-busting body shot, causing a reaction similar to a drunk person who ate a whole bunch of donuts when they got the drunk munchies. Like the look on that guy's face when he has to pay for his sins on the toilet the next morning is the face Saziani made when that body shot landed. It went far beyond the guy who's desperately trying to hide his suffering. This was the kind of reaction you'd expect on a medieval battlefield from some peasant who spent his life specializing in potatoes, staring down at his exposed intestines. That's how this dude took a body shot. And instead of recognizing Saziani's agony and stopping the fight, Herb allowed him to take 10 completely uncontested punches. Not a single indication of an ability to fight back. I do not know what Herb was looking for here. The next late stoppage went down on the same card. This actually might be why people think Herb sucks. He's famous and his failures come in clusters. It was Mansour Abdul Malik versus Wes Schultz, the main event of Dana White's Contender Series Week 1. Abdul Malik came in a 4-1 favorite, performing as such. Schultz had some things to say about it, a couple smother sessions, couple kicks in the wind. Nothing connected clean, and the power differential showed itself within the first few exchanges. Towards the midpoint of round 2, Abdul Malik's gas tank started to fade a little bit, creating a few opportunities for Schultz to impose his grappling, but all he did was gas himself out in the process. Upon separation, Abdul Malik senses the urgency that he needs to take this dude out before he catches his breath, so he presses forward, landing a beautiful jab and stuffs Schultz's emergency takedown. It was pretty much curtains at that point. Schultz had no gas with a much bigger man on top laying some stiff ground and pound on him. Super uncomfortable to watch because Schultz just slowly gets smothered and contorted while Abdul Malik fucking pounds the fuck out of him. And to Herb Dean's credit, this finish was one set of elbows from perfection. The first set, as you can see here, clearly and concisely separates Schultz from his will to live. He was defending himself quite well at that moment, so this is where Herb should have said, okay, 7 unanswered elbows from the full mount after a whole bunch of nasty ground and pound. Schultz is covering up like he's trying to drunkenly hide his eyes from the sun. I should stop the fight now. However, Herb does not make that decision, and Schultz has to take 9 more unanswered strikes, most of which being elbows. Alright boys, it's time for Herb's redemption, and I'll admit it brings a wee bit of joy to my heart knowing that from this point on, I'm mostly gonna have nice things to say about the refs. I've had a great time diarrhea shitting in Beltran's mouth for 47 minutes, Dan Mergliotta was a hoot and a half, but now it's time to snuggle up by the fireplace with some hot chocolate, simmer ourselves down a little bit, and reminisce about the good times. Starting with a Contender Series bout between Antoine Ho and Lonier Kavanaugh. I would give bonus points for this one if I could. You got two undefeated flyweights fighting in an even pace. Out of nowhere, Kavanaugh lands a straight right hand and Tuan Ho's lights disappear. They don't even go out, they fucking left. Kavanaugh rushes in for some extra shots, but holy and balls, look at this. With the wind at his back and a cape around his neck, Herb Dean flies into frame, saving Tuan Ho from unthinkable torture. Not a single corpse punch was administered on this day, and when you look at the state Tuan Ho was in while he was recovering, I mean, it would have been really bad if he had to take those extra shots. Kavanaugh was beyond fresh. Next up, we got Do Hoo Choi versus Bill Algeo. Herb definitely ate his kick cereal that morning. I'm thoroughly impressed by this stoppage. Well, maybe not so impressed with the stoppage itself, because the fight did need to be stopped when it got stopped. What I'm so impressed with is Herb's ability to catch an extremely slight help me signal Bill gave when Choi broke his orbital bone. He caught it in real time. It took me at least 4 rewatches in high definition to catch. And when you look at it in slow-mo, it still doesn't necessarily look like a help me signal. It could have been easily misconstrued as, hey, I'm good, don't stop the fight or something. I mean, we saw in the crappy examples that Herb won't stop the fight just because somebody crumbles in pain. This time he predator scans and sees Bill's signal, fucking jumps in as fast as he could, and Bill only suffered 1 extra punch before they got separated. The shot definitely landed near the injury, so that sucks, but if it was any of the D-tier refs, I think 7 or 8 would have been the number. Next up, I believe we have the only doctor stoppage TKO on the redemption list. I had to debate this one with myself because I didn't consider doctor stoppages when I created the point system. Ultimately, I ended on the thought that doctor stoppages are technically TKOs, not only in the official sense, but also in the practical sense. When a fighter has an injury that's hindering his ability to defend himself, such as an eye that's swollen shut or a craterous wound above the eye that's gushing blood into a fighter's vision, you have to classify that fighter as unable to continue. And the ref has to be scored on whether or not they stop the fight within a reasonable time frame. I would say a reasonable time frame is before the round concludes, or in other words, as soon as the fighter's injury gets bad enough that it overtly affects their defense, the ref has until the end of that round to stop the fight. In this case, Herb Dean doesn't need any of that information because as soon as he took a good look at the fucking fruit ninja slice on Drew Dober's face when he fought Gene Silva, the fight was immediately stopped. The cut opened up in the first round and remained manageable for almost 2 rounds, but due to Silva's constant deliberate targeting of the cut over and over again, the muscle tissue inside Dober's face started glistening like a hidden item. Silva pointed out these developments to Herb, who was standing on the opposite side of Dober's cut. Now, of course, Herb ignored the shit out of him because he knows he's a fucking idiot, but when he finally circled around, I imagine he got the feeling cops get when they find a blood trail in the cashier's apartment. Drew had to take 1 more elbow while Herb was buffering, but he got in there before any more damage was done to the cut. Finally, we have Joe Pyfer versus Marc-Andre Barriault on the UFC 303 prelims. There isn't much to this finish. Barriault took the nap he was supposed to take less than 90 seconds into the fight. Pyfer hit him with a disgustingly fast combination followed by 2 patiently placed strikes that shut Barriault's shitty Canadian lights out. Herb stepped in right before Barriault took any extra punishment, and that concludes our first B-tier inductee. Next on the list is a deliciously zesty individual who's grown on me a lot since his infamous Usman Covington cover-up. He's still a corrupt piece of shit, fucking soggy crumpet asshole, but when he's not failing for promotional reasons, he's damn good at his job. So good that all I have as far as major screw-ups go is a single allowed foul that pissed me off for the same reason Usman Covington pissed me off. It went down on the Whitaker versus Aliskerov main card between Shara Magomedov and Antonio Tricoli, and I know for an alleged fact that this shit was politically motivated. Usman Covington happened because Goddard's a pussy-ass redcoat who hates Trump. This one happened because Abu Dhabi has part UFC ownership, allegedly. Tricoli. The fight began with Tricoli doing the only thing he could do against a fucking Russian Maury Povich guest, which is pin him against the cage and cheat. Tricoli took a nice fistful of fence to give him extra momentum on a knee. The knee lands and bada boom, Goddard's in there faster than you can say dead queen. He rightly takes Tricoli's position away and gives him a very squeezy warning before resuming action. 100% a valid decision under those circumstances. Great job, Mark. Now let's flip the script and put Mr. Funky Genetics on the receiving end of a foul. It goes down with about a minute to go in the second round, and Tricoli had Magomedov in a familiar clinch position. Tricoli attempts to pull Magomedov away from the cage in what was supposed to be a takedown, but his efforts were rendered shite when Magomedov got a fistful of his own fence. The would-be takedown fell apart at the seams, and what do we see Mark Goddard do? A warning at a fucking distance, a finger wag. In a crucial moment for Tricoli, dude got TKO'd right after this. You have to either give Tricoli his position and warn Magomedov squeezily, or take a point. I don't see any gray area here. All I see is an undefeated fighter that need be protected like he's fucking Michael Jordan. So I say shame on Mark Goddard for selling his soul to the Saudis. But other than that, the man is polished. Even his late stoppage couldn't be included because it met my standards for a late stoppage perfectly. It would just be a boring waste of time. So we're just gonna get right into Goddard's greatest hits. Beginning with part 2 of the Magomedov trials, we have the aforementioned downfall of Antonio Tricoli. And I gotta go to DC's commentary for this one because he seemed authentically frustrated by Goddard's inaction on the fence grab. He makes a good point that if Magomedov was appropriately penalized, Tricoli at least had the opportunity to salvage a draw. I would take that point a step further and say this matchup, in essence, had 2 routes. Tricoli takes Magomedov down or Magomedov tears him to pieces on the feet. So to me, a point deduction almost makes no difference after Tricoli's only successful takedown attempt gets stuffed by a cage grab. That was his only chance. He was running out of gas with a minute left on the clock. He's got more submission victories than anything else, so him taking advantage of Magomedov's grappling shortcomings, like that was it. And Goddard took that opportunity away from him. In the third round, Magomedov's pressure became too much for Tricoli. He had so little left in the tank that he couldn't even keep his hands up. Magomedov stormed in on him, relentlessly landing clean shot after clean shot, and Goddard stepped in as soon as Tricoli dropped. He was defending himself, I would say, adequately until the stoppage. He was obviously gassed beyond belief, but he did his best to roll with the punches and fire back. I say picture perfect stoppage, and I hate to see a fight like this come with a giant asterisk, especially at the hands of a measurably top-tier referee. Next up, we have Robert Whittaker versus Ikram Aliskerov. What an appropriate follow-up. A fight where Goddard had no room to slip his dirty little flue powder smelling fingers into. Ikram came in as a shocking and unexpected last-second replacement for Khamzat Chimaev. Yeah, nobody thought Shot was showing up, but at the same time, Ikram Aliskerov was not goofy Jack Hermanson. Ikram was an undiscovered safari Pokemon that nobody knew what the fuck he was capable of. One loss to Khamzat Chimaev on the regional scene and a sleepy Makachev look to him. That's all we got. Of course, Robert whipped out his butthole for everyone to smell, said this douchebag, and put his ass to sleep in the first round. It came off a beautiful 1-2 that Aliskerov should have been prepared for, but as Robert throws his jab, you see Aliskerov drop his left hand trying to get some extra momentum on a counter knee. I think he might have been expecting Robert to shoot because at the same time his right hand is still at his waist. Unfortunately, that was not Robert's plan, and Aliskerov basically teed himself up for a devastating right hand, cueing the never-before-seen Russian chicken dance. Aliskerov did everything he could, being the first of his kind that's going through that situation, but Robert was not in there trying to brawl. He gave Aliskerov less than 0 opportunities to capitalize on a mistake as he landed a barrage of laser-accurate strikes. And Mark Goddard slides in, the second Rob drops him for good. I would definitely say the last 2 shots were unnecessary. Goddard barely scraped by on this one, but it's a great stoppage nonetheless, and Aliskerov. Finally, we head back to the prelims of UFC 303 in a bout between Charles Jourdain and Jean Silva. Now, I didn't know this until about 5 minutes ago, but Jourdain was almost a 2-1 favorite coming into this fight. It's insane to think that Silva went from that to a coin flip against a 10 pounds heavier Drew Dober based solely on this fight. And to his credit, it was well deserved. Charles Jourdain is to this day somebody you do not want to around with. He never has the size advantage and he has the worst luck on planet Earth, but when it comes to technique, he's disgusting. disgusting. Jean Silva, on the other hand, he has that thing around him. I don't know what it is, but sometimes fighters get this thing going on. You see it with Joe Anderson Brito, you see it with Alex Pereira. You might even throw Jack Della Maddalena in the mix, where it's this aura of unstoppable power that all the other guy can do about it is run away. That's what Jourdain went through fighting Silva. It was pitiful. Graciously, after a round of abuse and with teacup in hand, Goddard jumps in as Silva drops Jourdain for a second time. And I know Silva doesn't really try to put a stamp on it with ground strikes, but I'm thinking he absolutely would have if Goddard hadn't stepped in. This was not a walk-off knockout. Goddard could have easily forced the get-up like he did the first time Jourdain got dropped. Jourdain was not unconscious here. So credit to Goddard on this one, and whoever manages Charles Jourdain, please stop torturing him with shitty matchups. He's not fucking Barbosa. Nobody's gonna crowd around a smelly couch at 1 in the morning for a win-or-lose Charles Jourdain main event. Dude, I don't know how long this video has gone on for, but I give zero fucks because we have entered A tier. There are so few mean things to say about referees of this caliber that I've switched my beer out for a Wendy's milkshake. We begin with the half pilot, half referee hybrid Mark Smith. This guy looks like he referees teenagers' behavior in his neighborhood. I bet Mark Smith was actually a hall monitor back in the day. I got money on that shit. Matter of fact, Mark Smith is so fucking naturally diligent at his job. I would argue he's being underutilized by society. I understand he flies planes on the side and whatnot, but this guy needs to be commanding a SWAT team. I mean, it legitimately baffles me after spending hours upon hours watching him that he makes any mistakes at all. Mark Smith, and I'm saying every time he refs, he reminds me of the first time I tried Adderall. I got it from a stranger before an exam I didn't study for, and I fucking aced that shit with nothing other than coked out determination. But you look at Mark Smith and you think that's a guy who hasn't touched a drug in ever. Fucking back in high school, that dude was busting his friends for smoking pot in the school parking lot. So the fact that he's so fucking autistically focused every second of the fight is just something my drunk, unappreciative ass doesn't deserve. Cause you know what? There's nothing in the sport of MMA that's worse than a questionable win. And the second worst thing is all of our favorite fighters taking so much extra damage that they can't stick around as long as they otherwise might have. Refs like Mark Smith and all the refs who are higher on the tier list are not only saving bouts from inconclusive endings, but continuing the paths of our favorite savages despite getting the shit beat out of them. So that's my Wendy's milkshake love letter to Mark. Let's get into his only notable mistake. In the Apex, Kyle Nelson took on Steve Garcia, putting a 7-fight win streak on the line between the two of them. Honestly, the most useless waste of a couple unranked prospects that I've seen recently. This fight meant less than nothing, especially for Garcia, whose record is poop. Dude's trying to pull a Charles Oliveira comeback for 13 fat in a warehouse. Sean Shelby or whatever goofball pulls the cord on matchups needs to stop using our dream girls like jerk-off sleeves for 2 seconds and think shit like this through. Put your unjustifiably good life the computer illiterate fans subsidized on hold for as long as it takes you to form a coherent thought and put Garcia versus Nelson. I mean, if you're gonna fucking do it, how about a crowd? How about some fucking human life in the picture, eh? I mean, for Christ's sake, it shouldn't take a stoned idiot in his basement to point this out, but we press on. It was the first round and immediately Garcia heats up the tension. He throws a body kick with a little bit too much force and Nelson is able to push it aside as Garcia attempts to bring his leg back. It completely shuts down Garcia's balance and Nelson turns the scramble into a dominant grappling position. He held on to Garcia for almost 2 minutes until a last-ditch effort to escape results in Garcia narrowly avoiding an armbar and finding a dominant position of his own. This time though, no subs were on the menu. It was fucking discount knuckle sandwich platter for Kyle Nelson. I counted 28 strikes landed out of like 50 thrown, including a fucking gnarly back of the head elbow by Garcia. And I would say Nelson intelligently defended himself up until the 17th or 18th. It wasn't a disgustingly late stoppage, but Mark Smith failed to hit the mark here. I should be shot for that. Next up, we have what I would call cake icing. I don't think redemption is the right word at this point. It comes on the main card of Nicolau versus Perez between Honata Denise and Austin Lane. This one was a major test for the up-and-coming prospect in Honata Denise, and Austin Lane gave him all the adversity he could ask for. Within the first minute, Lane easily secured a takedown that Denise would spend the rest of the round trying to scramble out of. Lane beat on him relentlessly through all of his efforts, and the fight was likely to be stopped if Denise hadn't been saved by the bell. Despite this fraud check-esque whooping, both men went to their corners looking like they'd been in a 46-round boxing match. So when the second round commenced, whoever was coming out of this one was all but certain. And unfortunately for Austin Lane, Lane, he used way more energy keeping Denise down than Denise did eating punches. All of Lane's takedown attempts were pathetically stuffed. He couldn't get anything going against the cage. Denise was tired for sure, but his pissness about getting ripped for 5 minutes probably overrode that, because after spending the majority of the round fighting for survival, Lane finally caves to a massive 2-3 and lands on the canvas with the same thud the troll from Harry Potter made. It was like watching the wind blow the fucking Statue of Liberty into goddamn New York Harbor. I'd be willing to bet the t-shirt kiosk guy in the lobby felt vibration in his Reeboks after that fucking North Tower impression. And of course, Mark Smith steps in directly after the finishing blow, mostly to clear Denise from the impact zone. But that's it. Mark Smith's lone perfect stoppage. He was so proficient at shutting down foul play that the man needed a singular great stoppage to put himself levels above Goddard and Dean. So with that, we head to our final A-tier inductee. He is a man who makes up for his lack of size with an abundance of spunk. It is Jason Herzog. He comes in 2 points ahead of Mark Smith, and surprisingly, he's got a couple boo-boos to discuss. Firstly, we have a bout that went down on the main card of UFC 306. Daniel Zellhuber took on a guy with a way more Puerto Rican sounding name. Fucking Daniel Zellhuber sounds like an effeminate med student from Minnesota. Esteban Ribovic sounds like the dude in the cartel who's so good at skinning faces that's his job now. He's the face skin guy. He's the guy that can go from the under chin to the back of the neck in 3 slices and wear your face like a scarf. Yeah, I don't know how to segue out of that. The first round began with heavy exchanges back and forth between Ribovic and Zellhuber. It was a clear fight of the night in the making. Both men set a viciously fast pace. The only problem was that Zellhuber must have seen the Weidman Silva fight and thought, hey, I've got some fucking long ass witch fingers. Why don't I stick them out the entire fight like a pussy cunt with shit in it? Except we're not dealing with the likes of Gary Copeland here. This is a guy who most people would be shocked to find out he made second place on this tier list. So in essence, this fight asks the ancient question of what happens when an unstoppable, eye-poking, shitbag ass douche meets an immovable guy who's really good at his job. And the answer is nothing. Herzog let Zellhuber get away with 3 entire rounds of outstretched fingers. He stopped the fight to give a verbal warning in the 3rd round that Zellhuber didn't listen to. And in total, I counted 3 unaddressed eye pokes from Zellhuber that Ribovic just fought through like a savage. I cannot express the joy I felt when Ribovic got his hand raised. This was one moment of justice for the world after what happened to Bruno Silva. Also, Jason's inaction is fucking sickening at his level of competence, so it goes to show you that this eye poke nonsense is going nowhere fast. Next up, we got Damon Jackson versus Shepe Mariscal, and again, the foul we're about to go through is not one you'd expect from a referee of this caliber. In fact, this fight alone accounted for 60% of Herzog's pre-redemption total. It went down in the 1st round right about the time Jackson realized he took a left when he should have took a right. Mariscal easily tosses Jackson's takedown aside and gets on top to rain down some ground and pound. He blasts 8 shots before Jackson gets himself up, but you'll notice that not all of them are clean. Out of 8 strikes landed, 5 landed to the back of the head, including like a punch elbow hybrid type strike that actually opens up a wound on the backside of Jackson's head. None of these fouls were addressed despite Jackson pleading with Herzog in plain fucking English. And to top it off, the 3rd round saw another back of the head strike that was also ignored. Finally, we get to the last of Herzog's sins. This was a fight that disappointed a lot of people because it was such a beautiful stylistic matchup, and a matchup that absolutely delivered on the hype. It was Jared Cannonier versus Nazdarene Imavov, and wasting no time, we jump right into the moment in question. Imavov landed a clean right hand that almost took Jared off his feet, and for like 15 seconds, Imavov chased Jared's wobbly self around the octagon, trying to land anything he possibly could. There should have been some Benny Hill music to that shit, but Herzog, out of nowhere, decides he's gonna ruin Jared's semi-existent title chances with a swift wave of the hands. I didn't see a shred of inability to fight from Jared. He was clearly compromised, but he fought back every step of the way and even landed a massive right hand seconds before the stoppage. I'm not saying it would have changed the outcome. I mean, it looked pretty bad for Jared, but it's like, come on, brother. This dude is old as shit. You gotta give him the opportunity to get properly dropped before you can cast him back into obscurity. Okay, now it's time to get to some redemption. We have 2 fantastic stoppages to cover, beginning with Johnny Walker versus Volkan Ozdemir. Talk about casted back into obscurity. Poor Johnny has not had a fun year. Got put away for good by Magomed after pussing out of the first loss. Now he's got an incredibly skilled striker to deal with in Volkan Ozdemir. And within a minute of the 1st round, the skill gap on the feet became Johnny's worst enemy. He couldn't get anything going while Ozdemir landed shot after how is he not dead yet shot. This went on for a little over 2 minutes before a delayed left hook drops Johnny for what looked like the end, but Johnny miraculously dodged all of Ozdemir's finishing strikes and finds a way back to his feet. It was as glorious a victory as it was short-lived, because to this point, Johnny hadn't landed shit. 2 leg kicks and a jab if you're being generous, so Ozdemir's fucking spit-shine forehead was fresh and ready to go. He didn't give Johnny a second to breathe before storming him with nasty precision. It was very reminiscent of the Imavov Cannonier situation, and in this case, Herzog let the finish play out perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. Ozdemir landed 1 extra shot on Johnny's unconscious body, but as soon as Ozdemir threw the finishing blow, Herzog was in there to stop the fight. Next up, we got Bruno Ferreira versus Dustin Stoltzfus, and let me say, I've watched so many fights over the last few days, I feel like a toddler in shock. I feel like the last Japanese soldier in a kamikaze line, but when I rewatched this friggin' gem of a fight, I got the warm fuzzies all over again and everything was better. These boys banged from the start of the fight to the bitter end, and holy shit, what a bitter ending for Stoltzfus. The guy's career has been so up and down, and he was doing so well against Ferreira, I almost had some hope for a comeback, but a spinning back elbow from literal Satan sent Stoltzfus into fucking nowhere land. And right now, I want to take a moment to admire Herzog's phenomenal decision making here. He sees the back elbow land, but instead of immediately stopping the action, Herzog gets just close enough to observe Stoltzfus's body language before he pulls the trigger. And you know what? I don't have a problem with that mindset. I know it interferes with the action a little bit. I mean, you really can't pump fake a guy that's in the process of beating the shit out of someone, but I'll offer one alternative in defense of interfering in this manner. And this is what I'll end on, because Herzog stopped the fight perfectly and there's nothing more to be said about that. But what I ask is this: would you rather have Herzog interrupt the finish for half a second and decide not to stop the fight, effectively freezing the fight and preventing the finish from proceeding naturally? Or would you rather take the Cannonier Imavov situation and have a fight stop definitively when it shouldn't have been? That's something you can take to the shitter and ponder for a while. Alright, motherfuckers, are you ready to question everything you think you know? I'm not, because I calculated this shit like 9 days ago. For 9 days, I've been sitting on the biggest MMA bombshell since whatever the last retarded non-journalist thing Ariel did was. I'm talking the Epstein tapes, the truckload of dead Gazan babies. This is a Fox News alert to end all Fox News alerts. Ladies and gentlemen, the Glass Cannon certified God status referee for 2024 is... Carrie Hatley. Guys, I have no explanation. I don't even know how to present this without saying, look, bro, I checked twice, okay? The fact that it wasn't Herzog f***ed me up for 13 hours. The fact that Hatley didn't come up by the time I got to C tier had me wiping sweat from my brow. But goddamn it, with the power invested in math, I crown Carrie Hatley the best referee in the UFC. Now let me backtrack. Maybe everybody knew this already. Maybe goofy MMA fat Stephen McDaniel revealed this secret months ago. I have no clue because I'm too busy making MMA content to watch it. But as far as I'm concerned, before this very moment, Carrie Hatley was the alcoholic stepdad of UFC refs. You got people calling for his firing en masse because of a situation we'll get to in a minute. You got me thinking, who the let this hitchhiker decide cage fights? I mean, for Christ's sake, Joe Rogan takes every opportunity he can to praise Herb Dean's greatness. John Anik praises Jason Herzog and Mark Smith all the time. Why have I not heard a peep about Carrie Hatley? I have no clue why this guy doesn't get more props, but either way, let's get into the only notable flub from Carrie Hatley in his last 20 fights. It went down between Bobby Green and Jalen Turner. This one's a doozy, man. Bobby was inferior to Jalen in every conceivable way, and within 2 or 3 exchanges, it turned into the classic Bobby Green trying to wuss up his way out of a horrible mismatch. Very similar to his fight with Poirier, except this time, Bobby had the pleasure of experiencing what being knocked out 4 consecutive times feels like. I imagine it's something along the lines of a lot of pain followed by more pain, and then the pain slowly gets replaced by echoes of your swishing brain. And in cycles too. Dudes literally go going in and out of consciousness multiple times, laying flat on his stomach. Probably has no idea where the punches are coming from, can't even really move his arms, so he's just taking it in the lubeless asshole. In my opinion, this one goes down as at least top 3 worst stoppages of all time, and it's really sad that it had to be the S tier guy of all people. But I mean, considering Hatley's otherwise near perfect record, you're left to assume Carrie's judgment simply got away from him that night, and that it's not at all indicative of his overall job performance. But rest assured, my ass is gonna be all over his ass in the year 2025. This ain't the Hunger Games, bitch. I'm gonna do the same performance evaluation next year with a fresh set of fights to scrutinize, so you'd best stay on your game, Buster. And with that, let's get into Hatley's finest moments, starting with Taiga Iwasaki versus Yuzuri Balgarui. You might as well throw alphabet soup at the fucking wall, bro. It was the 3rd round and Iwasaki was having a horrible time with his gigantic opponent. Belgardu hit him with a voluptuous knee from 30 yards out. That's just not fair. And to Iwasaki's credit, he takes the shot better than most, but unfortunately Mr. Fantastic Arms was running at him with contract acquiring intent. There was no time to recover, though Iwasaki did an incredible job of surviving in his compromised state. And right when it looked like Belgardu was losing some steam, a short right hand drops Iwasaki to his knees, and Carrie Hatley's right in there to stop the fight. Absolutely perfect decision making. He could have jumped in at any moment, but Iwasaki stayed calm and fired back until the moment he dropped. Beautiful. Last up, and to end the ultimate UFC referee tier list, we got Navajo Sterling versus Philip Latu. This fight was directly after Iwasaki Belgardu, so I guess we do doubles sometimes. I wasn't aware the UFC was fucking Instacart. Pretty soon we're gonna have reports of refs pissing in ice mountain bottles between jobs. But the finish happened in the 2nd round of a surprisingly close fight. Latu's durability gave him a very real chance to get a dub despite his spot as a 3-1 underdog. But when they came together for a friendly exchange of left hooks, Latu's chin hourglass ran out of sand and Carrie Hatley busted in to stop the action. Sterling kinda landed one more punch before Hatley got in there, but you can see he was 100% stopping that fight after Latu dropped. So there you go. That is the ultimate UFC referee tier list. I really hope this video didn't suck ass, and congratulations to the #1 referee in the sport of MMA.